Hey, Dr. Mike Scheeringa here. If you've been paying attention to the news at all, you've undoubtedly heard of this frightening thing called toxic stress. It's the extraordinary theory that trauma or severe stress can permanently change your brain, the trajectory of your life, and change the very core of you as a person. The bottom line, in my opinion, is this theory is not proven true. In the first part, I'll explain what it is. In the second part, I'll explain the research on why it's not true. Then I'll explain how it was invented by activist doctors as weaponized neuroscience for their social agendas. Over the past 20 years, I've studied this issue extensively and conducted more neurobiology studies with young children in PTSD than anyone in the world, so I know a bit about this. Stay tuned to the end and I'll give my interpretation about why this false theory became so popular. First, this is a disclaimer that I'm not giving medical advice. I'm simply providing education about terms used in psychiatry and other mental health fields. The story about toxic stress is complicated and involves research, social activism, ideology, and morality. This video is the 30,000-foot view. I'll use other videos to explain the key aspects in more detail. The detail is also in my new book, The Trouble with Trauma. So in part one, I'll explain the theory of toxic stress. It's an extraordinary theory when you stop and think about it. It says that just psychological stress can somehow trigger a process inside your body that can permanently damage your brain in a lot of very, very bad ways. It is alleged that trauma can literally damage the neurons in your brain, can shrink the size of important brain centers like the amygdala, the hippocampus, corpus callosum, and other brain centers. It can disrupt the functional activity of key parts of your brain needed for emotional and rational thought, like the prefrontal cortex, limbic system, and executive functions. It can dysregulate cortisol levels, which is your major stress hormone, and it can dysregulate autonomic functions like heart rate and blood pressure. A related theory to this that needs to be mentioned is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Theory, or ACE. Toxic stress is based in large part on the body of ACE studies about adverse childhood experiences. The ACE theory claims that a wide range of trauma and stress in childhood cause a wide array of physical diseases in adults, including heart disease, the #1 killer worldwide, and diabetes, the #6 killer worldwide. But the theories go much farther than that. According to these theories, toxic stress and its close cousin, the ACE theory, trauma and stress cause not only psychiatric syndromes and deadly physical diseases, they can also cause nearly all the disparities found in disadvantaged people, like violence, crime, joblessness, homelessness, and poverty. The believers in toxic stress have their own ideology and social agenda. They've packaged their action steps into something called trauma-informed care. In order to try to prevent crime, violence, poverty, homelessness, and all the other social disparities that they see, they claim society must transform using these trauma-informed care approaches. So what happened over time is that the literature on the neurobiology of trauma and stress has really evolved into three literatures. The first is the basic literature on trauma and PTSD and neurobiology, which for a long time, and a lot of the studies stuck pretty simply to the science of trying to understand a disorder. But then toxic stress and ACE started borrowing from this literature and evolved their own spin on it, and for needs of marketing for the social agenda, veered off into a literature that is ideological, calling for public health activism and social policy activism that attributes trauma to causing all these other disparities in life. It's become enormously popular. I've detailed in my book how toxic stress articles are espoused as fact in scientific journals nearly 30,000 times per year. News stories, of course, call toxic stress fact in thousands of stories every year. Nearly every professional organization that has to do with children, women, and disadvantaged populations espouses toxic stress and ACE as facts. Every government agency that has to do with these populations also has statements on their website or publications that agree that toxic stress is fact. And states and legislators have been persuaded by these things and are now enacting these social policy agendas. For example, California, for the last couple years, has been spending $40 million of taxpayer money to screen for ACEs in pediatric clinics, and other states are trying to get into the same action. In part 2, I'll describe whether there's any evidence to support the toxic stress theory. There are a number of problems I see with the situation. The first problem is that there has to be a mechanism to explain how all this damage happens to brains. There has to be some endogenous, normal process in the body that gets triggered to go haywire and wreak havoc on the brain. The main culprit that's usually singled out is cortisol. Excessive and prolonged levels of cortisol are known to cause serious health effects, so that seemed like a likely target for this kind of theory. Cortisol gets targeted because we can see the effects of excess cortisol in something extreme like Cushing's syndrome, with high blood pressure, rounded red faces, weak bones, and weak muscles. However, the alleged victims of toxic stress are never described as having the symptoms or looking anything like the patients of Cushing's syndrome. Apparently, it's some kind of milder form of damage from cortisol levels. There are hundreds of studies on cortisol, trauma, and stress. However, they are wildly inconsistent. Some studies show high cortisol levels in trauma and PTSD victims, some show low levels, and some show normal levels. It's an interesting theory, but high levels of cortisol have never been documented in a single human being following trauma or stress that appear to cause all the problems that are attributed to the trauma in the toxic stress and ACE theories. Newer mechanisms besides cortisol have also been put forward, such as methylation of DNA and inflammation factors. However, these things are even more of a black box, and nobody really knows how they work, and there's even less evidence to support them as the endogenous chemicals that cause all this damage. The second problem that I see is that the power of certain types of research to prove cause and effect has been misrepresented. It seems pretty clear that individuals with PTSD do have some neurobiological differences compared to those without PTSD, but toxic stress claims that trauma caused those neurobiological variables. There is an alternative theory besides toxic stress that explains how neurobiological differences exist in those with PTSD and trauma histories, and that is that the neurobiology differences existed prior to trauma exposure and serve as vulnerability factors for the development of PTSD. This is called the diathesis stress theory. Whether we can conclude that toxic stress versus diathesis stress is true all depends on the type of study design. There are two main types of study design that are important to distinguish. This graphic illustrates the two types of theories, diathesis stress and toxic stress. On the top, diathesis stress is the theory that the neurobiological differences existed prior to trauma exposure. And then when individuals are assessed after trauma exposure and have PTSD, it looks like they have neurobiological differences, which they do. In the toxic stress theory, it says that people were basically normal in terms of neurobiology prior to trauma exposure. And then they were exposed to trauma, and they developed both PTSD and the neurobiological differences. Okay, so now most of the research that gets cited by toxic stress supporters is what's called cross-sectional research. In cross-sectional study designs, they look at people at only one point in time, which is always after trauma exposure. So that's on the right side of the graph, highlighted with the black border. This is when they evaluate people post-trauma. And you can see if you only look at individuals at that point in time, they have PTSD and they have neurobiological differences. But because they were only assessed at one point in time, you cannot tell which caused which in a cross-sectional study. I call the studies on trauma and neurobiology between 1985 and 2005 the first wave of research on neurobiology in trauma because they were all cross-sectional studies. The question of whether human brains can be permanently damaged by psychological trauma is really a simple question to test scientifically. The way to test it is with a second type of study design called pretrauma prospective studies. In a pretrauma prospective study, you examine human brains before they are ever exposed to psychological trauma, wait for the psychological trauma to occur, and then re-examine the individuals a second time to see whether any changes have occurred. It's really not that complicated. In 2005, researchers started to publish pretrauma prospective studies for the first time. That's why from 2005 to the present, I call this the second wave of research on neurobiology and trauma. In 2021, I published a qualitative review of all of these second wave pre-trauma prospective studies. I found a total of 25 studies with this design. The studies included brain imaging, cortisol regulation, autonomic responses of heart rate, and skin conductance, and a variety of molecular variables. All 25 studies measured neurobiology before trauma exposure and were capable of testing the diathesis stress theory. 19 were positive and 6 were negative. This is pretty consistent evidence that the diathesis stress theory is true. 10 studies measured neurobiology both before and after trauma exposure and were capable of testing the toxic stress theory. 3 were positive and 7 were negative. This is pretty consistent evidence that the toxic stress theory is false, or at least unproven. 7 years earlier, Julia DeGangi and colleagues had published a very similar literature review. Their conclusion was the same as mine, where they wrote in their paper, quote, "Long-considered aspects of post-trauma psychopathology were actually present before the index trauma," which is evidence for diathesis stress, not toxic stress. These reviews show that there is no consistent evidence for the extraordinary toxic stress theory, which would also mean that the ACE model is not true, and the evidence strongly supports diathesis stress theory. There's a long explanation in my book of why these studies are so misunderstood. Cross-sectional studies violate the principle of exchangeability. That's a detailed topic that's complicated, and I'm not going to cover it in this video, but if you want the details, they're explained in my book, and maybe I'll do a whole show on it at some other time. A third problem I see with the research is the entire concept of toxic stress just doesn't hold water. Humans just aren't that fragile. Think about it that our species has existed for thousands of years, maybe millions of years. Our ancient ancestors encountered life-threatening situations on a regular basis, perhaps even more frequently than we do in modern society. And there is no evidence that human brains have been slowly whittled away by damage from toxic stress over all those years. In fact, until toxic stress theory came along, our species was thought of as being remarkably resilient. So now in part 3, I'll give my interpretation of how I think all this happened, and toxic stress and ACE are believed to be true when in fact they're not. I think it starts back in the 1980s and 1990s when we had the beginning research on neurobiology on patients with PTSD for the first time. And we found all sorts of interesting correlations between PTSD and different neurobiological indices. Then in the 1990s, activist scientists who wanted to rid the world of violence and abuse and or correct inequities that they viewed in disadvantaged populations had hit a wall. Lots of progress had been made in those areas, but they began to realize that they could make more progress if they had a way to get more funding. A subset of these activist scientists figured out they could weaponize the PTSD and trauma research and leverage it to make trauma and stress sound 1,000 times more scary and dangerous than it really was. For example, in 1998, Vincent Folletti published the first adverse childhood experiences study where they invented this ACE model. In the year 2000, Dr. Jack Shonkoff and his friends invented the toxic stress strategy. The term toxic stress didn't exist prior to the year 2000 when Shonkoff invented it. Toxic stress is not a scientific term. It's a marketing strategy. We have their own words in print admitting it with no shame that the invention of toxic stress was in essence a marketing strategy to get attention for their causes. The toxic stress and ACE strategies have been wildly successful. As I mentioned earlier, many researchers, journalists, government agencies, professional organizations, and legislators have all accepted toxic stress without question. Since the promotion of toxic stress has clearly been an activist intervention, it begs the ultimate question: why is a subset of very vocal activists doing this? And if toxic stress is not true, how are they getting away with it? I explain this in detail in my book, The Trouble with Trauma, and I've explained it briefly in another video titled, What is Psychological Trauma? Basically, a subset of research activists with skewed moral foundations have embarked on a lifelong mission path to fight for disadvantaged populations to inflate their own flagging self-esteem, and will do and say almost anything to achieve their social agendas. The truth doesn't matter. Having the most useful belief system is what matters to them. In conclusion, this is an extraordinary story. Humans have lived for millions of years in highly stressful and often traumatic situations, and we're considered pretty resilient. There has never been any suggestion that our minds have been slowly rotting away due to the pounding damage of toxic stress for thousands of years or more. And then, in the blink of an eye around the year 2000, we're told that everything we believed yesterday is no longer true, and suddenly humans are fragile, with toxic stress causing extraordinary damage to brains and causing every disparity of disadvantaged populations. As a result, an essentially political ideology was marketed to get attention and to get funding. It affects you, the average citizen, because it's your taxpayer money that they want, and the end game is to impose programs and rules on society that will impact you and your children. I call this the first modern example of weaponizing neuroscience to promote a social and ideological agenda. That's all for now. If you want to learn more, there's much more detail in my book and some other videos I posted. Comments are welcome as always. Let me know if there's a topic you'd like me to cover. And if you found this helpful, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel.